right. Hello, everybody. I think we'll probably get a few more folks trickle on here, but we'll go ahead and get started so we can get the controls passed over to Dr. Neil Grigg here at Colorado State University. We're finishing up our Thrust C research seminars with a presentation from him today. So as a reminder, Thrust C explores how cities can intentionally foster the widespread adoption of infrastructure, development patterns, consumer behaviors, and management practices that advance sustainable water management. To understand overcoming barriers to adoption of sustainable solutions, the social and behavioral systems that govern change are investigated under this research thrust. We only have one more webinar remaining in our research series, and we're going to take just a little one-week break to accommodate our thrust level meetings that are scheduled for next week. And we'll conclude this series on Thursday, November 16th with a presentation on the UN Blueprint and Sustainability Indicators from Drs. Matt Zakarabi and Andre Dozier here at Colorado State University. We're still recording each webinar and posting to the YouTube channel, and I'll be sure to send out a link to this video as soon as it's ready. And as a reminder, you guys have entered muted, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat queue, and we will address them at the end of Dr. Grigg's presentation. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Neil Grigg, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at Colorado State University. When Dr. Grigg first came to Colorado State in 1967 as a graduate student, his emphasis was on hydraulic engineering. Over the years, his focus has evolved to include management issues of water resources, civil infrastructure, and pipeline systems. Dr. Grigg is currently involved with other faculty members on projects relating to clean water, hydrologic and ecological systems, and pipeline management. Dr. Grigg also remains involved with business and professional groups to advance the causes of effective water and infrastructure management. And with that, I'm going to hand the controls over to Dr. Grigg here. Bear with us for just a second while we get that set up. Right, and I can see your PowerPoint, and I know we can hear you, so take it away, Dr. Grigg.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and I'm pleased to present the current status of our project on financial models and strategies. As Sarah introduced, it's part of the C Thrust series, and our focus is about how you can make the transition to One Water, and with a focus on using financial strategies and organizational techniques to bring this about. And I'll explain how that relates to the transition in a little more detail as we go along. So let's see what I need to do. When the first time I tried to advance my slide, it didn't advance. Maybe I need to do something different. Here we go. Okay. Well, Sarah explained what Thrust C is all about. Thrust A and Thrust B are about research and transitions of research, application of research. Thrust C has a lot more to do with transitions, implementation, and topics that get us into the real management issues, which tend to be very interdisciplinary, very intersectoral, a lot of practical difficulties as well as research topics. We're going to hear more about that when we hear that next webinar on November 16th, as Sarah pointed out. So the bullets that you see there are a review of what we're trying to do with Thrust C, foster the adoption of the infrastructure, overcome the problem that existing approaches to managing urban systems are locked in, they're dependent on certain paths and protocols, rules and cultures that have to do with governments and utilities and other organizations. And then we recognize that overcoming these barriers means that in addition to knowing about the organizational aspects of the utilities, we also have to understand the social and behavioral systems of the people who make the management come about, but also the stakeholders. So there's a lot of different actors involved, institutions that are involved. There are a lot of different activities and agents, all the way from the building scale up to large metropolitan regions. So with all of that, it's understandable that Thrust C focuses a lot on integration, and especially the use of urban planning with urban water management. That kind of integration is a focal point for it. So in previous webinars, we've gone over the stakeholder inputs, and our project on finance was not one of the original projects, but when the stakeholder involvement team went to the different regions, they found that there was a lot of concern about finance, and the different types of concerns and the areas that they went into were quite variable. It wasn't just a matter of enough money. It's also how you can use the money in more flexible ways and things like that. So the many different aspects of finance that were on the table led to this project. So it was organized after the overall UN project had been going for a good while. So this is a list of the different concerns that came up by the stakeholders that related to finance in one way or the other. The first one is a natural that you would expect, because there's been so much publicity about aging infrastructure and the demands that it places on the ability of cities and utilities to meet their needs. And then you have a certain amount of stovepiping within public works organizations, utilities, and city governments. So the financial officers who are there, who are the ones who are going to be responsible to come up with strategies and implement them, they want to participate more in the implementation of One Water and not just be isolated off to the side as players that move money around but don't have anything to do with what the money is for. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, the line managers, like for a utility or a public works department, they would like to be more involved in the formation of these financial strategies. So everybody's kind of feeling a need to break out of the shackles of the old traditional financial approach and to move into the future with a more innovative and flexible strategy that would hit this objective of having the triple bottom line work out better in financial assessments. Now that would mean that some controls had to be relaxed. For example, the enterprise funds that lock financial management into stovepipes in the utilities and departments needs to be, the controls on those need to be released some. And then GASB Statement 34, which is a government accountability standard for government, Government Accounting Standards Board, financial statement number 34, needs to be able to treat innovative cross-cutting technologies like green infrastructure better than it can right now, because it's locked into traditional ways of doing things. And finally, when it comes to debt financing, the bond markets and the people who are responsible for large amounts of money, they need to be convinced that new programs such as water conservation, which is one of the One Water strategies, should qualify for bond financing. So there's a lot of issues out there relating to finance. These issues tend to be practical issues confronting people every day in the utilities and the cities. So you wouldn't see those phrased exactly the way that this slide has them on the cutting edge of research statements so much as you see them listed in the world of city management and utilities. So it's a good example of how we need to be engaging our research and our researchers with the people in the local governments to make the research findings pan out. And that's what our project is all about. So as we approached the formulation of this project and we got going, we asked ourselves in the beginning, what is it we're trying to do? What are the problems that we're trying to address with our financing strategies? And right now, the problems in urban areas are stovepiped. They're locked into traditional practices like imported water coming in, used once in the city and then discharged back to the stream. Very inefficient, not integrative approach at all. not resource sensitive. Then stormwater is in a similar way. The practices have been implemented. The main goal was to drain the land. That destroys streams and ecosystems. It has a lot of negative impacts that need to be addressed. And as a result of all of these, we have a lot of expensive legacy infrastructure that's out there. It's water supply, wastewater, and stormwater, as well as peripheral supporting systems like pumping stations and canals and things like that. And this legacy infrastructure needs a lot of attention in the financial realm. Just today, on the web and the newsletters that are out there, was a statement that the Stormwater Managers Association, one of those associations, I have to look up the name of that one, has made a proposal to create a new report card on stormwater infrastructure that could go along with the ASCE infrastructure report card, which lacks stormwater. And if they are able to do this, then that would add stormwater infrastructure, which would be a really good move for One Water into the overall realm of recognizing infrastructure in general. And then another issue that is being faced by the utilities and organizations is regulatory compliance and financial challenges. One of the biggies there, which I'll mention in a few minutes, is combined sewer overflow compliance, which links a lot with green infrastructure. And it shows how regulatory compliance is a key issue in the overall implementation of One Water. So finally, all of this has to be done with affordability in mind, because if these new approaches are implemented in a way to increase the technological level and add a lot of systems to promote green infrastructure and related systems, it could up the price tag if it's not done in a way that's economically feasible, and that would have the tendency to increase the bills and hurt lower income ratepayers. So we have to keep that in mind as we go along. So this is our team. That's me. That's Teresa Connor, and that's Alex Moss. You can see that Alex is probably the member of our team who's having the most fun all the time. He likes to climb rocks and things like that, and that's evident. So our team was organized somewhat differently than the other UWIN teams. The other UWIN teams were, for the most part, built into the original proposal. They came in with budgets, with plans to involve graduate students, different teams of researchers, and so on. Since we were organized later, we came on board to use the capabilities that we already had to create a project that was meaningful with the goals that respond to the stakeholder inputs and the needs of the other researchers and the overall UWIN project needs. And so we don't have student teams. We don't have a long-term research strategy built in from the beginning. What we have is a project that had a fast start. I'll explain in a minute how that started out with an assessment of what the current management environment is all about. And then we wanted to identify how research could make a contribution to those stakeholder inputs and move the overall UWIN program ahead with the financial issues in mind. So the scope of our project evolves as we go along, and it is evolving as we speak. Having said that, we don't have as elaborate a research plan as some of the other projects do. For that reason, my presentation here may not last the full hour like some of them would, but it'll last a good while to show you several different things that we're doing. But I wanted to explain the difference in the scope of our project with the other projects so that you'd have an understanding. So to start with the focus on One Water solutions, or total water solutions, integrated urban water management, everything that UWIN is doing comes back to this concept of integration. Integration has got a lot of different names to it. It can be confusing to some people because many times they're not sure exactly what you mean by integration. And so we started out with a firm intention to explain what we mean by integration. And when you look at it carefully, you see that what most people are talking about is integrated urban water systems at two different levels. One level, which we're calling the basic level, has to do with integrating the traditional fit-for-purpose water systems together to get more bang for the buck, so to speak, more outcome, more productivity out of the existing systems by managing them together. And I'll give you a few examples a little bit later. But you can see those on this diagram, which shows a reservoir on the left with the white stream trace coming down, the diversion for water supply, treatment plant, distribution system, and so on. That connected to the wastewater collection system, treatment plant, and so on, disposal. But then water reuse as a possibility, and then drainage, stormwater drainage, going into the receiving waters, integrating all of those together by linking systems, having reused water, having water conservation, perhaps capturing stormwater, different things that you can do to integrate at this level of the infrastructure, so to speak. Now, for the most part, what you see on that slide is utility-based. I mean, there might be one utility that runs everything. It may be separate utilities that run all the different things. It's going to be a different situation in every community, but it would still be utility-based. And because utilities, for the most part, operate according to enterprise financing and rate structures, it means that most of the financing for this is expected to come from rates and not to have much in the way of any tax subsidies or anything like that. Another incidental, which is kind of interesting, if you look over at the American Water Works Association, AWWA, you see them talking with a new slogan, Total Water Solutions, which sounds a little bit like an integrated one water approach, and it is. If you'd like to know what they're talking about with Total Water Solutions, you can go to one of their lines where they explain, we care about water no matter where it is. So that picture is an illustration of that. The water is in different places, but a utility that wants to look at it with Total Water Solutions in an integrated way from a utility point of view is going to approach it to care about the water, no matter whether it's the raw water source supply or it's the reused water coming out of the wastewater plant. They want to be concerned about it everywhere. And in order to do that, you have to start integrating your financial streams as well as integrating the water purposes if you're going to have a true integrated approach. So that's the basic level of one water. And the next level is the expanded level. And many times when people are talking about integrated urban water systems or integrated water resources management at a higher level, they're talking about this. And the nexus approach, which you hear often these days, water energy, water food, nexus, and so on, is also something, a concept that operates at this expanded level of one water. And what it means is that the basic level system, which you see in the middle, is now integrated with other parts of an urban economy, other sectors. You see health, ecosystems, the local economy, energy, and agriculture. All of those can kick in and be part of an expanded level of one water. But the way this level is managed is different than the basic level of one water. At the basic level of one water, the utility officials pretty much call the shots because they're in charge of everything. At this level, they have to cooperate more on an even playing field with the officials who are coming from these other sectors. So it becomes more of a collaborative approach. And because many times the projects that might be developed, like for example a green infrastructure project that's got multiple co-benefits for different sectors, it starts to move out of what you would call a regular utility deliverable, and it becomes more something which can be characterized as having the attribute of being a public good. For example, green infrastructure that's going to have a benefit, let's just say, of reducing the heat island effect. That's going to be more of a public good than it is a kind of a utility good, which can be measured and charged for with benefits that can be assigned to individual users and so on. So at this level of expanded OneWater, because of this public good attribute, you're going to see different approaches to financing, which in some cases can include tax financing, public-private partnerships, and a different set of strategies than you would have with the basic level. So putting the basic level and expanded level of OneWater just into their categories, you can see that there's a lot of opportunities to create more livable cities, healthier cities with an integrated approach, at the same time that we overcome some of these legacy infrastructure problems, and we can capture these co-benefits that will have they are attracted to these other sectors as well as the water and the utility sector. That's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to figure out in this project what the financial strategy should be to bring that about. So going back just briefly to the OneWater approach as the main strategy, there are a lot of people who are saying very praiseworthy things about OneWater. This is a quote from Rob Renner, who's the CEO of the Water Research Foundation that just merged with the Water Environment and Reuse Foundation. And you can see what he said, a very optimistic view of what can be done with this OneWater approach. Challenge we have, which is at the center of the financing strategy, is how to bring that about. So what we are challenged to do then is to take these basic systems, the basic ones on the left, roll up the drinking water, wastewater, stormwater systems, merge our interests with the other sectors of the city to come up with an integrated total system that leads to a water-wise city. You'll see that water-wise city slogan around in different places too. Now our team, when we first started working, we had some strategizing sessions trying to figure out what the main topics were that focused on financing. I mean, there's a lot more to it than just where you come up with the money. And this is the list we came up with: the planning and budgeting systems, how you organize for shared governance and coordinate among interest groups, including in regions, how you can innovate with instruments like grants or green bonds, work on the financial accounting systems like GASB 34 and the enterprise system that I mentioned before, resource conservation, how you can implement that and have financial incentives, how you can build capacity, because there's a lot of places where the financial officers, the water line managers, the accounting groups and all of that, they don't have the understanding and training to promote integration. Work on the governance and regulatory levels, and then even bring in the private sector and focus on social responsibility so that we can promote approaches like public-private partnerships. So those were big topics that we were interested in. Given the limited scope of our team, we're not able to focus on all of those topics, but we think that we can push those out to other parts of UWIN, and they offer opportunities for some real payoff, low-hanging fruit, if you might say, in some of those categories, with some payoffs that would really work out for our stakeholders. So as we embarked on this, we ask ourselves the question, well, what would success look like in our limited project? And it would result in improved access to financing, the vehicles of financing like the bonds and rate structures and so on, and how the funding would be obtained, where the revenues would come from. And if it facilitated this move toward one water, either at the basic level or the expanded level, then we would consider ourselves successful. And the obstacles that you can see where the improvements need to be are defined by this slide. It works well in those stovepipes, at least water supply side. Sometimes the stormwater side doesn't work so well. The water recycling side is still a work in progress, but it does need improvement across the board, especially for wastewater, stormwater, and recycling. The decaying infrastructure crisis needs to be addressed. Externalities need to be rolled into the financing. And as I mentioned before, the bond funds for green infrastructure and co-benefits like for ecosystem protection need to be rolled in to improve this overall system. This is a view of how we view the system. This is a flow chart of the one water system, and right here in the middle are the fit-for-purpose water systems, the four systems that I've been talking about: water supply, wastewater, stormwater, and recycle water. They link to the environmental water system, the natural water system, through green infrastructure and different linkages that we have here. And you can see a lot of things on this chart that we want to work toward. You can see outcomes that would be those that we're looking for, how we would indicate with performance indicators how successful we are, what the external pressures are, what some of the sectors are that we need to connect to up in here, and so on, how the governance works over here, the organization works, and so on. So I won't dwell on that chart, but it's like a defining chart to show the conceptual framework of all of this management and financing. So here's a couple of the examples that I mentioned to illustrate exactly what we're talking about when we move from the traditional stovepipe financing to the one water approach. And this would be in the recycling category. Like in traditional financing, you would consider wastewater as like a service. Just collect, treat, and dispose of wastewater. Over on one water side, you might treat that effluent as a resource. On a traditional, you wouldn't be doing recycling, but if you went into the one water approach, then maybe you're going to recycle, and you have to price that. And then if there's no method to finance recycling over in traditional financing, because they're not practiced, and even if it is practiced in a limited way, you wouldn't know how to finance it, then one water would come up with some innovative ways to recycle or to finance the recycling through giving credits and so on. Here's an example in stormwater. Traditional financing where the stormwater is just draining the city. Could be the stormwater is not harvested for sure. It could be a service financed through a utility, which is a cutting-edge approach in some places, but it's still not one water until you start looking at advantages like harvesting the stormwater for different things, looking at co-benefits, using tax financing to cross over with your benefits, for example, to land, and maybe even using rate funding as a credit for the aquifer recharge because you're getting a benefit to another service, water supply, from the stormwater utility. So here's one final example from the green infrastructure category. Traditionally, no recognition of green infrastructure. If there is any, it would be financed without any involvement of the water utilities. They wouldn't be involved in that. But if we go to one water, then you're going to see green infrastructure and its co-benefits funded by the beneficiary. So if the water utilities turn out to be a beneficiary, through, for example, through ecosystem services, then they would participate in financing of the green infrastructure. So we, having all of that as baselines and knowing where we wanted to go, as we embarked on the early phase of our research program, which went about over the last year. Since we started late, you would say we were about 1 year into what we intended to do now. We started out saying, you know, all of this theory is great. Conceptual visions like OneWater are super. We love those. But every city's different. Utilities are different. If this is going to work out, it's going to have to be doable locally. Of course, we give a lot of credit to Teresa Connor, who's a key member of our team, and she's a experienced utility official and knows about this kind of thing, being in touch and knowing how utilities see this. And it's critical to recognize their point of view if you're going to have any success in implementing anything. So we wanted to get past the visionary conceptual stage and use case studies as we started out and actual experience through a survey, which I'll explain in a few minutes, to demonstrate the local successes that people have had as well as barriers that they've run into in implementing OneWater. So we, of course, could not take on a big case study project ourselves since we had limited funding, limited capabilities. So we went initially to 3 sources of case studies that had already been completed in the recent past. One of these was by W.R. WRF, W.R. and Recycling Reuse Foundation. This is a picture of their cover. Institutional issues and barriers. Second one was a blueprint for OneWater. That was financed by the Water Research Foundation, different project. And then the third was this one, the OneWater Roadmap, that's put out by the U.S. Water Alliance, which is a network, a consortium of different water interest groups focused on how we can improve the overall water management in the United States. So that's 3 different sets of case studies, each of which has something to do with OneWater. Use the term OneWater. So what these do is to bring on the table what people mean by OneWater and different points of view, a lot of different stakeholders, what they mean. So that's really the evidence of what's out there. It's more valuable than our conceptual viewpoints are, unless they're connected to real-world examples like this. So as we went into their case studies, there were about 60 in the 3 of those. So there was some overlap, and you could count it a little more than 60 if you wanted to, but 36 were identified as having significant financial content and approaches that merited further study and inquiry on our part. And as you can see, we categorized those into 5 groups so that we could explain what's going on out there. Case studies tend to be so different that if you don't classify them, if you don't look for variables that are similar from one case study to another, you can just view each case as a different story and you don't see the similarities. So the classification and the categories are essential. So you can see that most were the financing that's facilitated somehow by coordination, organizational approaches. Second, most memorable are grants, which were made to encourage and facilitate this from higher levels of government. Third is resource conservation. Fourth, regulatory mandates. And fifth, corporate stewardship. And I'll give examples of each of these so you'll see what is meant by those categories. Starting out in a category of coordination, cooperation, organization, those really fit into 4 subcategories: public-private partnerships, joint financing, projects that have multiple benefits, stormwater and watershed utilities that coordinate within the utilities, and then metro scale planning type approaches. So if you look at these, starting out with the public-private partnerships, they take different approaches. And of course, public-private partnership, there's a lot of different kinds right from the beginning. The private side of that is ordinarily going to be land developers, property developers, homeowner groups, and things like that. So one of these partnerships was in Australia. It was called One Water. And in that one, developers were installing roof water harvesting systems, and they got a financial adjustment for fees. So you see it's a financing approach because you're getting some action from the developers and you're giving them some financial credit, which comes in from the public side. Then in New York City, there's a Battery Park City Authority, and it permits and it gives credits for recycling schemes to the developers. Then San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, it gives credit when you can show a community benefits in your procurement for your water systems. Finally, in this category, we had Madison, Wisconsin, and they offered shared costs when you could show phosphorus reduction in any particular way. Then the joint financing, that gets into projects where different agencies of a city government can come together and they can pool their money and finance a project because it's got multiple benefits. That requires flexibility within the city governments. We had two examples where that's exemplified. One is in Los Angeles, which has a One Water program. Another one was Spokane, Washington, which has a formal way to coordinate its investment in projects. Then the stormwater and watershed utilities, that illustrates a place, sort of a place-based approach where just having a utility in a watershed or in a small basin where you have a stormwater utility provides the basis for shared funding. A couple of examples there were like in Cincinnati, where we had a stormwater combined sewer mitigation program going on with several collaborations. And then Austin, Texas formed an actual watershed protection department that enabled them to address multiple approaches at the same time. Then in the metro scale approach, there are other examples of each of these, but for shortage of time, I won't go into those. Metro scale was Sydney, Australia, where you have a special approach for metropolitan level government where the regional governing council can allocate and move money around from one place to another to encourage One Water approaches. Now grants, the next category, are kind of similar to that. When a grant is given by a higher level of government to a lower level of government, the governing authority for the grant program, like a state government or a regional governing council, regional government, federal government, they can use grants to incentivize integrative approaches. So there's a long list there that you can see. They have different purposes, different types of agencies. They range all over the place from state government, just like Minnesota, wanting to change their point system for wastewater grants to incentivize co-benefits. New Orleans, Detroit, places like that to have a focus on environmental equity and justice. San Joaquin Valley was similar to that. Pittsburgh, Three Rivers, stormwater, wastewater together, combined sewers, things like that. So a lot of different approaches can be taken with the grant type program. Resource conservation is an older approach to this. Water reclamation, waste to energy, water conservation, a lot of examples. For example, California, Santa Clara Valley Water District constructed a $72 million recycling plant, some cooperative funding in that. The waste to energy combined with wastewater systems, recycling systems, a lot of examples around the country like that. City farm programs like out that U.S. Water Alliance identified in the Salinas Valley, California, connected to the Pure Water Monterey program. a lot of examples of resource conservation. The challenge, of course, on the financial side is to come up with a scheme where the resource that's being conserved can also create a revenue stream. Regulatory incentives are fairly common in the OneWater field, and there's some examples which have been described in the literature pretty well, particularly those where the regulatory consent order included a green infrastructure credit that the utility got. One of the most famous, of course, is Philadelphia's approach with CSOs to green infrastructure. A lot of publicity has been given to that approach. Finally, the corporate social responsibility. If a corporation, like in this case Coca-Cola or Dow Chemical, see an advantage to their business model to work with the public sector, like in watershed improvements, like Coca-Cola does, then you have a OneWater approach involving big involvement of a private sector partner. So going back, just to those categories, you can see there's a lot of different ways that financing can be illustrated through these case studies. Now, most of those case studies are either in their very beginning or they might be something which is planned. In some cases, there'll be some results. But what we found in looking at them is you can see the financing strategy, no matter what the ultimate benefits and outcomes are, you can see which way those financial strategies are going. But there's a lot of barriers out there. And these are places where a lot more research is definitely merited. Basically, that list of things that you see there as barriers, like coming up with incentives for shared funding, for example, like we illustrated with the OneWater in Los Angeles, agencies sharing funding. You can just imagine there's all kinds of bureaucratic barriers, accounting barriers, stovepipes, cultural barriers, and things like that. So there's a lot more research needed to crack these barriers to integration. So that was the end of one phase of our research, was to show what we had found out with those case studies, identify barriers, point to future research that can be done, and so on. And we published one paper. It was in the journal published by SAGE. It was called Public Works Management and Policy. And it pretty much tracked the results that I just showed you. The next phase for our research is survey work. And Alex Moss is leading the survey work, being supported heavily with Teresa Connor, is helping to get the survey out, to interpret the results, and so on. I'm working with the team, with them on the team, and we're at the point where we've completed a test run of the survey, and we are ready to get the full survey project out, and it's going out as we speak. So I thought I would show you very briefly what the survey looks like, and this is it. Let's see. My slider over here is kind of in the way. If I hide that, it doesn't work. That's okay. I'll be able to do it. Anyway, with the survey, I'll just show a few of the questions on it. I can't quite use my slider because I can't see how. I guess I could use it like this, but it's not as satisfactory to go up like that. I guess what I'll do is this. If you'll, if it'd be okay if you don't mind if I scroll down quickly. This is the beginning of the survey. We wanted to explain to people what we meant by urban integrated water management, what we were trying to do, and so on. And of course, if anybody wants a copy of the survey, would like to help us push it out and get some responses for it, we'd be happy to get it out there. And then there's questions about the finances of a city or a utility or an agency, There's questions about the utilities themselves. These questions here are all about sources of revenue and things like that. And then, let's see, the previous one that I just scrolled down pretty quickly was the water supply one. Then this would be the wastewater. Questions are the same. Do you have any non-rate-based revenue sources, things like that. This is the stormwater, very similar. What kind of stormwater services do you have? And then we have one for integration. Well, we have this one for reclaim water. So that's the 4 services. And we have one, that green infrastructure that I just went by very quickly. And then you have the green infrastructure. And it's an interesting one because it would get into, well, what are the funding sources for green infrastructure? If we can get some good responses on that, it'll propel this project way ahead. And then you've got the integration part of the questions. So that's pretty much the survey that's going on. And then the initial results I've got here, and you can see a little bit about the initial results. This went out to just a few people. Here's the repeat of the statement. And then you can see on our questions of the financial outlook, you can see there's kind of a split on stormwater, drinking water, and wastewater. This would certainly be expected. Stormwater views financial outlook is very poor, a lot more than drinking water would. On the question of participation in One Water, a little bit surprising in some cases. Well, it's not surprising that a lot of them are not funding green infrastructure, but a lot of them are funding, well, a lot of them are not funding a livability approach either. So those are the kind of results that we got. Level of integration. I don't have enough time to go over these in great detail. Alex and Teresa could interpret them a little bit more. Teresa is on the call, so if there are any questions, we could interpret them. She could help us interpret them. Here's another page on that with more details and what we found out. So that's the end of our presentation as to what we've done so far, what we plan to do in the future, what the scope of our project is, and so on. And it'd be time to go to any Q&A, and then any questions that we got. I was hesitating because I was reading Mary's question there about the use of the slider bar on the survey. I like it too, but I didn't program it in about how well it works. Alex programmed that in. I don't know whether he would know how well it works or not. So, I guess Sarah, I should kick it back to facilitate any Q&A or to go ahead and finish up the webinar. So, Sarah, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Neil. That was very enlightening. Yeah, I see Mary's question. Not everyone can see it, so I'll just repeat it so everyone knows what she asked. She commented that's an interesting use of the slider bar in the interactive survey, and she is wondering if there's been research about how this works compared to the scale of 1 to 10 kinds of surveys. So unfortunately, I don't think we have a good answer for that at the moment, but great comment nonetheless. For the rest of you guys, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat queue and we can address them. I might just give it a second or two here, see if anything else pops up. Do you have any closing remarks there, Dr. Grigg?
I wanted to ask Teresa if she had anything to add, if I had really missed anything. If she's still on, I'm not sure she's still on.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. No, Neil, I think you did a great job covering it. The finance part is much more steeped in rules and regulations, and you kind of see that feedback that the regulatory and legal constraints on how and where money can be spent is one of the most common barriers that we run into. But we haven't engaged the financial officers that deeply in the One Water conversation as an industry throughout the utilities, and they do, you follow the money, and it really is it's a struggle for innovation and for adoption of these practices. So we'll be interested to get a broader response on this survey.
We did get one question from Paula Conley. She's wondering, does the survey include questions about what those restricting rules and regulations are?
Well, that's we do ask them to go into detail, to be specific about what are the regulatory and legal constraints, and it's a qualitative, it's an answer box, text box answer. And, we haven't gotten much specificity, so we were thinking we do get the names and contact information for the people doing the survey, that we might, one of our next steps maybe see if we could get an interview with these folks to go more in depth, because just coming from the utility industry, sometimes it's in your bonds, your statements of your bond issuances for your money, or for your capital funds. There's constraints. Sometimes it's in the GASB rules, as Neil covered. And sometimes it's just in your rate documents or your governance documents of your utility. So it can be quite variable. And so one of our next steps may be doing some interviews to go a little bit deeper down that question.
Great, thank you, Teresa. Hopefully that answered Paula's question. Haven't seen anything else pop in, so Paula says yes, thank you. So I think we addressed that. Thanks for your time today, Neil and Teresa, and everybody else for tuning in. I'll send out the link once we have it posted to YouTube. And a reminder, we won't be having a webinar next week. We're taking a break, and we'll see hopefully everybody on Thursday, the 16th of November. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thanks for your time today.